First story, The Blonde Strand, my night with alien visitors. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It's been years, and I still can't shake the memory of that night. July 23rd, 1992, a date that's forever etched in my mind. I was living in Sydney, Australia, at the time, just trying to live a normal life. But what happened to me was anything but normal. It was around 7:30 in the morning when I woke up from what I thought was just a weird dream. I was lying on my bed fully clothed, which was odd because I distinctly remember going to bed in my pajamas the night before. As I tried to piece together what was going on, I realized something was terribly wrong. My body felt heavy, like it was made of lead. I couldn't move a muscle, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if I was frozen in place, held down by some invisible force. Panic started to set in as I realized I was experiencing sleep paralysis. But this was different from anything I'd ever felt before. The air in the room felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. That's when I saw them. Two female figures appeared at the foot of my bed, seemingly out of nowhere. They weren't like any women I'd ever seen before. The first one had these enormous, dark eyes that seemed to bore right into my soul. Her gaze was so intense, so alien, that I felt like I was being dissected just by her look. The other one was equally strange, but in a different way. Her features were perfectly symmetrical, almost too perfect to be human. It was like looking at a living, breathing work of art. They both had pale, almost luminescent skin that seemed to glow in the dim light of my bedroom. Their hair was a pale blonde, almost white, and it flowed around their faces like it was underwater. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was still completely paralyzed. All I could do was lie there and watch as they approached me. As they got closer, I noticed more details about them. They were both tall and slender, with long, graceful limbs that moved with an otherworldly fluidity. Their bodies were humanoid, but there was something off about their proportions. Their fingers were too long, their necks too slender. The one with the dark eyes reached out and touched my forehead, and I felt a jolt of energy course through my body. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was intense, like every nerve in my body was firing at once. The other one, the symmetrical one, stood back and observed, her head tilted to the side in what seemed like curiosity. I tried to speak, to ask them who they were or what they wanted, but no sound came out. It was like my voice had been stolen along with my ability to move. The whole time, those dark eyes never left mine. I felt like I was falling into them, like they were pulling me into some other dimension. What happened next is something I've struggled to comprehend ever since. The symmetrical being leaned in close, her face hovering just inches above mine. I could feel her breath on my skin, cool and oddly sweet-smelling. Without warning, she pressed her lips against mine in what I can only describe as a kiss, but it was unlike any kiss I'd ever experienced. It felt invasive, clinical, as if she was trying to extract something from me rather than show affection. I felt a strange sensation in my mouth, like something was being pushed down my throat. I wanted to gag, to pull away, but I was still completely immobilized. The dark-eyed one watched this happen with an expression that seemed almost amused, if you could call it an expression at all. Her face remained largely impassive, but there was a glint in those impossibly large eyes that suggested she was deriving some sort of satisfaction from my discomfort. As suddenly as it had begun, the kiss ended. The symmetrical being pulled back, and I saw something clutched between her teeth. It looked like a thin, white strand. With horror, I realized it was one of my own hairs, plucked from my head during this bizarre encounter. Time seemed to lose all meaning during this encounter. I couldn't tell if it had been minutes or hours since these beings had appeared in my room. The paralysis was still in full effect, leaving me helpless to do anything but observe as they continued their strange examination. The dark-eyed being moved to the side of the bed, her gaze never leaving my face. She reached out with one of those impossibly long fingers and lightly traced a line from my forehead down to my chin. Her touch was ice-cold and left a tingling sensation in its wake, like static electricity. As she did this, I felt a pressure building in my head, a kind of mental probing that I can only describe as someone rifling through my thoughts and memories. Images flashed through my mind at lightning speed. Childhood memories, recent events, hopes, fears, everything laid bare before these alien intelligences. I felt violated in the most profound way possible, not just physically but mentally and emotionally as well. The symmetrical being, meanwhile, had moved to the other side of the bed. She was holding something in her hand, a device of some sort that I couldn't quite make out in my peripheral vision. She pressed it against my arm, and I felt a sharp pain, like a needle being inserted. I wanted to cry out, to ask them to stop, but I was still voiceless, still a prisoner in my own body. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when I was on the verge of completely losing my mind, everything stopped. The pressure in my head vanished, the cold touch disappeared, and the pain in my arm subsided. The two beings stepped back from the bed, their movements perfectly synchronized. They looked at each other, seeming to communicate without words, and then turned their attention back to me. For a moment, they just stood there, staring. Then, in a blink of an eye, they were gone. No flash of light, no dramatic exit. They simply vanished as if they had never been there at all. The paralysis that had gripped me began to fade, feeling returning to my limbs in a rush of pins and needles. I sat up abruptly, gasping for air like a drowning man breaking the surface. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I looked around wildly, half expecting to see the beings lurking in the corners of my room, but I was alone. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the faint ticking of the clock on my nightstand. It read 7:45 a.m. Only 15 minutes had passed since I first woke up, though it felt like an eternity. I stumbled out of bed on shaky legs, needing to reassure myself that I was back in control of my body. As I moved, something caught my eye, a single strand of long, blonde hair on my pillow. With trembling fingers, I picked it up, staring at it in disbelief. It was physical proof that what I had experienced wasn't just a vivid nightmare or hallucination. Something had been in my room, something not of this world. In the days that followed, I struggled to make sense of what had happened. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone about it, who would believe me. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy or on drugs. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying every moment in my mind, trying to find some logical explanation. The blonde hair became my obsession. I kept it in a small plastic bag, examining it under every light, comparing it to my own hair and that of my friends and family. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, finer than human hair, almost translucent, and impossibly strong. I couldn't break it no matter how hard I tried. I knew I needed answers, but I didn't know where to turn. The internet wasn't what it is today, and information on alien encounters was hard to come by. I started spending hours at the library, poring over books on UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters, looking for anything that might match my experience. Most of what I found seemed like science fiction or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists, but occasionally I'd come across a story that resonated with my own. People who had experienced missing time, paralysis, and encounters with beings that defied explanation. It was both comforting and terrifying to know I wasn't alone. As weeks turned into months, the physical effects of the encounter began to manifest. I started experiencing intense headaches that would come on suddenly and last for hours. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of strange symbols in my peripheral vision, gone as soon as I tried to focus on them. My sleep was plagued by vivid nightmares that left me drenched in sweat, reliving the terror of that night over and over again. I became jumpy and paranoid, constantly feeling like I was being watched. Every unexpected sound made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. I installed extra locks on my doors and windows, bought a security system, but nothing made me feel safe. The worst part was the nagging feeling that it wasn't over, that they would come back for me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could sense their presence, only to find my room empty. The toll on my mental health was immense. I started withdrawing from friends and family, unable to explain why I was so on edge all the time. My work suffered as I struggled to concentrate, my mind always drifting back to that night and what it might mean. I knew I needed help, but who could I turn to? Regular therapists would probably dismiss my story as a delusion, and I wasn't ready to be labeled as mentally ill when I knew what I had experienced was real. It wasn't until almost a year later that I finally found someone who took me seriously. Through a support group for people who claimed to have had extraterrestrial encounters, I was put in touch with a researcher who specialized in these kinds of cases. When I told him my story, he listened without judgment, asking questions that showed he had heard similar accounts before. He was particularly interested in the strand of hair I had kept. With shaking hands, I handed over the plastic bag, feeling like I was giving away a part of myself. The researcher promised to have it analyzed, to see if we could get some concrete answers. The waiting was excruciating. Every day, I checked my phone obsessively, hoping for news. When the call finally came, I wasn't prepared for what I heard. The analysis had shown that the hair was not human in origin. Its cellular structure was unlike anything they had ever seen before. Even more bizarrely, it contained DNA that was a hybrid of human and an unknown species. The researcher's voice was filled with excitement as he explained the implications, but all I felt was a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. This was proof, undeniable scientific proof, that what had happened to me was real. That the beings who had visited me that night were not figments of my imagination or hallucinations, but actual extraterrestrial entities. And if they were real, that meant they could come back. The revelation about the hair's DNA sent me into a tailspin. On one hand, I finally had validation that I wasn't crazy, that my experience was real. But on the other hand, it opened up a whole new world of terrifying possibilities. If these beings were capable of creating human-alien hybrids, what was their purpose? Were there others like me out there? And most chillingly, was I somehow part of their experiments now? I became obsessed with finding answers. I delved deep into online forums, reaching out to other abductees, comparing notes on our experiences. Some of their stories were eerily similar to mine. The paralysis, the clinical examinations, the sense of lost time. Others were wildly different, involving underground bases or massive ships. But we all shared that same sense of violation, of having our lives irrevocably changed by forces beyond our understanding. I started keeping a journal, meticulously documenting every strange occurrence, every odd dream, every unexplained physical symptom. I was convinced that if I could just piece together enough information, I'd be able to make sense of it all. But the more I learned, the more questions I had. Why me? What made me a target for these beings? And most importantly, what did they want? As months turned into years, I found myself living in a state of constant vigilance. Every night, as I lay in bed, I'd strain my ears for any unusual sounds, my eyes scanning the shadows for movement. I installed motion-activated cameras around my house, hoping to catch evidence if they ever returned. But nothing ever showed up on the footage, just the occasional stray cat or wind-blown leaf. The lack of any further contact was almost as maddening as the initial encounter. I felt like I was in limbo, waiting for the other shoe to drop. My relationships suffered as a result of my paranoia. I couldn't bring myself to get close to anyone romantically. How could I explain why I sometimes woke up screaming in the middle of the night? How could I ask someone to share a bed with me when I was constantly on edge, expecting alien visitors? My friends gradually drifted away, put off by my obsession with UFOs and conspiracies. I couldn't blame them. From the outside, I must have seemed like I was losing my mind. But I couldn't let it go. The need for answers consumed me, became the driving force in my life. I attended every UFO conference I could, traveled to alleged abduction hotspots, even underwent hypnosis in an attempt to recover any repressed memories. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of something, flashes of sterile rooms, of other beings, of procedures I couldn't comprehend. But these fragments only added to my confusion, never providing the clarity I so desperately sought. It was during one of these hypnosis sessions, about 5 years after my encounter, that something unexpected happened. As the hypnotist guided me back to that night, I suddenly found myself reliving the experience with startling clarity. But this time, I could understand their thoughts, their intentions. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing me to access a part of my memory that had been locked away. I saw myself through their eyes, not as a victim or a test subject, but as something precious, something important. They were scientists, yes, but also caretakers in a way. The genetic material they had taken from me wasn't just a random sample. It was carefully chosen, part of a much larger plan. I saw flashes of other worlds, of a dying race desperate to ensure their survival. The hybrid program wasn't an invasion. It was a last-ditch effort at preservation. They needed us as much as we needed them, though we didn't know it yet. The symmetrical being, the one who had kissed me, was showing me all of this. Her mind touched mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of compassion and urgency. They were running out of time, and the future of their entire species hung in the balance. As I came out of the hypnotic state, I was shaking and covered in sweat. The hypnotist looked at me with concern, asking if I was all right. But how could I explain what I had just experienced? How could I put into words the cosmic scale of what I had glimpsed? The revelation from the hypnosis session changed everything. Suddenly, my fear and paranoia were replaced by a sense of purpose, of being part of something much bigger than myself. I stopped seeing myself as a victim and started to view my experience as a sort of cosmic calling. But this newfound perspective came with its own set of challenges. How could I possibly explain to others what I now understood? The few times I tried to share my insights, I was met with skepticism at best and outright mockery at worst. Even within the UFO community, my claims were seen as far-fetched. I found myself increasingly isolated, caught between two worlds, the everyday reality that everyone else inhabited, and the extraordinary truth that I now knew. I threw myself into research with renewed vigor, but this time with a different focus. Instead of looking for proof of the aliens' existence, I started investigating genetic engineering, evolutionary biology, and even theoretical physics. I was convinced that somewhere in these fields lay the key to understanding the hybrid program and its importance. I reached out to scientists and researchers, trying to find someone who might be open to the possibilities I was exploring. Most dismissed me outright, but a few were intrigued enough to listen. One geneticist, after hearing my story and examining the data from the hair analysis, admitted that there were aspects of the DNA structure that defied conventional explanation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As I delved deeper into my research, strange things began to happen. I'd wake up with complex mathematical equations scrawled on notepads by my bed, equations that I couldn't possibly understand in my waking state. Sometimes I'd find myself sketching intricate diagrams of what looked like advanced technology, my hand moving of its own accord. It was as if the knowledge imparted to me during that hypnosis session was slowly unfolding in my subconscious, bubbling up to the surface in fits and starts. I started to have vivid dreams, not nightmares like before, but dreams filled with images of other worlds, of advanced civilizations, of a future where humans and aliens coexisted. In these dreams, I saw myself as a bridge between the two species, a crucial link in the chain of events that would lead to this harmonious future. But the dreams were frustratingly vague on the details of how to achieve this. I'd wake up feeling like I was on the verge of a breakthrough, only to have the specifics slip away like sand through my fingers. The more I learned, the more I realized how much I still didn't know. It was maddening being given glimpses of this cosmic plan, but not having the full picture. I felt like I was putting together a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing, trying to discern the overall image from fragments. Years passed, and while my understanding grew, concrete proof remained elusive. I had amassed a small but dedicated group of followers online who believed in my story and supported my research, but to the wider world, I was just another crackpot with wild theories about aliens. The hair sample, which had been my one piece of physical evidence, had been lost in a lab accident years ago. Without it, my claims were easily dismissed by skeptics. But I knew what I had experienced, what I had learned. I couldn't give up, even as the years turned into decades and my obsession cost me jobs, relationships, and at times my peace of mind. There were moments of doubt, times when I questioned everything, wondering if I had indeed lost my grip on reality. But then I'd have another dream, another flash of insight, and my conviction would be renewed. I started writing a book, trying to put into words the incredible journey I'd been on since that July night in 1992. It was a painstaking process, trying to balance the need to tell the truth with the desire to be taken seriously. I knew that one wrong word, one claim that seemed too outlandish, and I'd lose all credibility. But I also knew that I couldn't water down the truth. The stakes were too high, the implications for humanity too important. Now, as I sit here putting the finishing touches on my manuscript, I can't help but reflect on the long, strange road that has led me to this point. It's been over 3 decades since that night changed my life forever. I'm older now, my hair graying, my face lined with the years of stress and searching. But my conviction remains unshaken. I know that what happened to me was real, that the beings I encountered were not figments of my imagination, but emissaries from another world, reaching out to humanity in our hour of need. I don't know if my book will be the catalyst that finally opens people's eyes to the truth. I don't know if I'll live to see the day when our two species openly cooperate for the betterment of both. But I do know that I've done everything in my power to pave the way for that future. As I write these final words, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. Not with malice or threat, but with anticipation. As if those beings from so long ago are waiting, hoping that their faith in me, in humanity, will prove justified. And so, I send this book out into the world, a beacon of truth in a sea of skepticism. To those who read it with an open mind, I say this: look to the stars, but also look within. The future of our species, of our very understanding of our place in the universe, depends on our ability to accept truths that may seem impossible. The beings I encountered that night in 1992 showed me a glimpse of that future. Now it's up to all of us to make it a reality. Second story: the Deckmont Woods Incident, a forester's alien encounter. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It's been years, but the events of that day still haunt me, keeping me up at night and making me question everything I thought I knew about our world. I was just doing my job, patrolling the Deckmont Woods near Livingston, Scotland, like I had done countless times before. It was November 9th, 1979, a crisp autumn morning that started like any other. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves and moss. As a forester, I was used to the quiet solitude of the woods, the gentle rustling of branches, and the occasional chirp of birds. But nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to encounter. I remember checking my watch. It was just about 10:30 a.m. when I drove my work truck down the forest road, making my usual rounds. The trees were sparse in this area, allowing me to see quite far ahead. That's when I first noticed something odd in the distance, something that didn't belong among the familiar shapes of the forest. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, hovering silently about 20 feet above a small clearing, was a large, dome-shaped object. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, metallic, dark gray, and about 20 feet in diameter. The bottom half was surrounded by a lighter band, almost like a flange, and it seemed to be rotating slowly. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes in disbelief, but the object remained. My heart started racing, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I'm not sure why, but some inexplicable force compelled me to get closer. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just shock, but I found myself walking towards this impossible thing. As I approached, the air around me felt charged, like the build-up before a thunderstorm. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and I could taste something metallic in the air. That's when things went from strange to terrifying. Without warning, 2 smaller spheres, each about 3 feet wide, dropped from the bottom of the craft. They moved with a purpose, almost as if they were alive, making a sound like gargled water as they rolled and bounced towards me. Before I could even think about running, they were on me. These things latched onto my hips and legs, their surface rough and cold against my clothes. I tried to fight them off, but it was like they were made of lead, impossibly heavy for their size. The panic really set in when I felt myself being dragged towards the larger craft. I clawed at the ground, desperately trying to find something to hold on to, but the forest floor just gave way under my fingers. Leaves and dirt flew as I was pulled along, my mind racing with terror. What were these things? What did they want with me? I yelled for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed up by the unnatural silence that had fallen over the woods. The last thing I remember before blacking out was a sickly, acrid smell filling my nostrils and a strange mist enveloping me. Then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, I was lying face down on the cold, damp ground, my cheek pressed against the forest floor. The taste of dirt and leaves filled my mouth, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had just tripped and fallen. But as consciousness fully returned, so did the terrifying memories of what had happened. I pushed myself up, my arms shaking with effort, and that's when I noticed the state I was in. My clothes were a mess. My work trousers were torn at the hips and legs, exactly where those sphere things had grabbed me. My heavy forestry jacket was in tatters, like it had been through a shredder. I looked down at my body, and my blood ran cold. There were strange, red marks all over my thighs and hips, almost like suction marks, but with an odd grid-like pattern. They weren't painful, but they felt hot to the touch, as if I'd been sunburned in perfect geometric shapes. I ran my hands over my face and felt similar marks there too. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what had happened. The forest around me seemed normal now, eerily so, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. But the evidence was there on my body, in my torn clothes, and in the lingering metallic taste in my mouth. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea how much time had passed. The sun's position had changed, but I couldn't tell if it had been minutes or hours. My watch had stopped at 10:30 a.m., the exact time I first saw that thing. Was it some kind of electromagnetic effect? I fumbled for my work radio, hoping to call for help, but it was dead too. A sense of isolation washed over me, more profound than I'd ever felt in these familiar woods. I needed to get out of there, to get home, to try and make sense of what had happened. I staggered to my feet, fighting against a wave of dizziness and nausea. The world spun around me, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out again. But I managed to stay upright, leaning against a nearby tree for support. That's when I noticed something else. The clearing where I'd seen the craft was different. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle, about 20 feet across, exactly matching the size of what I'd seen. And at the edges of this circle, several young trees were bent at unnatural angles, their tops pointing away from the center as if they'd been blown by some incredible force. My mouth went dry as I realized this wasn't just in my head. There was physical evidence. This was real. I don't remember much about my journey home. It's all a blur of stumbling through the woods, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I must have looked like a madman when I finally burst through my front door. My wife, Mary, took one look at me and her face went pale. I can only imagine what she saw. Her husband, usually so composed, now wild-eyed, clothes torn, covered in dirt and strange marks. She later told me I was babbling incoherently about flying saucers and metal balls. I remember collapsing into a chair at the kitchen table, my whole body shaking uncontrollably. Mary, bless her, didn't ask questions right away. She just wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and pressed a cup of sweet tea into my trembling hands. As the warmth of the tea spread through me, I started to feel a bit more grounded. That's when the tears came. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I broke down and cried like a child. The fear, the confusion, the sheer impossibility of what I'd experienced all came crashing down on me at once. Mary held me, not saying a word, just being there. I don't know how long we sat like that, but eventually, I managed to calm down enough to tell her what had happened. To her credit, she listened without judgment, her eyes wide with concern and disbelief. When I finished my story, the kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. It read 1:45 p.m. Over 3 hours had passed since my encounter, but it felt like both an eternity and a split second. Mary insisted we call the police, and I didn't argue. Part of me was desperate for someone official to see the evidence, to validate what had happened to me. But another part was terrified. What if they thought I was crazy? What if I was crazy? The local police arrived within the hour, and I recounted my story again, this time trying to stick to the facts as best I could. I could see the skepticism in their eyes, the slight smirks they tried to hide. But when they saw the state of my clothes and the marks on my body, their expressions changed. They took photographs, asked me to draw what I'd seen, and took detailed notes. I overheard one officer muttering to another about similar reports from around the world. That both terrified and relieved me. I wasn't alone in this experience, but if it was happening elsewhere, what did that mean for us all? The police agreed to accompany me back to the site, and as we drove there in silence, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What if the evidence was gone? What if it had all been some sort of hallucination? As we approached the clearing, I held my breath. But there it was, the flattened grass, the bent trees, exactly as I had left it. The police officer's demeanor changed instantly. They became all business, cordoning off the area with tape and calling for backup. They took more photos, collected soil samples, and measured the indentations in the ground. I stood there, watching them work, feeling a strange mix of vindication and dread. This wasn't just in my head. Something had happened here, something that defied explanation. As the day wore on, more officials arrived. Men in suits who didn't introduce themselves, scientists with strange equipment. They all asked me to recount my story, again and again, until the words lost all meaning. They seemed particularly interested in the small spheres that had grabbed me, and the mist I'd mentioned. One of the scientists examined the marks on my body, his brow furrowed in concentration. He muttered something about radiation, and took samples of my skin cells. Throughout all of this, I felt oddly detached, as if I was watching it all happen to someone else. It wasn't until much later that the full impact of what had occurred truly hit me. In the days and weeks that followed, my life became a whirlwind of interviews, medical examinations, and sleepless nights. The story had leaked to the press, and suddenly, I was thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. Journalists camped outside my house, each wanting an exclusive. UFO enthusiasts sent letters, some supportive, others accusing me of being part of some grand conspiracy. My phone rang constantly with people claiming to have had similar experiences, or offering to help me remember more details through hypnosis. I turned them all away. I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. I didn't need anyone else telling me what had happened to me. The medical exams were the worst. Doctors poked and prodded, took blood samples and brain scans. They found traces of unusual chemicals in my system that they couldn't identify. The marks on my body faded after a few days, but the doctors photographed and measured them extensively before they disappeared. They asked about my mental state, if I had a history of hallucinations or drug use. I answered truthfully, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. How could I blame them? If someone had told me this story a week ago, I wouldn't have believed it either. The nightmare started about a month after the incident. Every night, I found myself back in that clearing, reliving the terror of being dragged towards that impossible craft. But in my dreams, I didn't black out. Instead, I was pulled inside, subjected to unimaginable experiments by beings I couldn't quite see. I'd wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my wife trying desperately to calm me down. During the day, I'd find myself zoning out, lost in thought about what had happened. I'd catch glimpses of metallic objects out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The forest, once my sanctuary, now filled me with dread. I couldn't bring myself to return to work, the thought of being alone among those trees sending me into a panic. My colleagues were understanding, but I could sense their unease around me. Whispers followed me whenever I ventured into town. There goes the alien guy. They'd say, some with pity, others with derision. I began to withdraw, spending more and more time at home, poring over books about UFOs and alien encounters, searching for answers. As the months passed, the media frenzy died down, but my obsession only grew. I started connecting with other people who claimed to have had similar experiences. We'd meet in quiet cafes or online forums, sharing our stories in hushed tones. Some of their accounts were eerily similar to mine: the metallic craft, the small spheres, the lost time. Others seemed far-fetched, even to me. But who was I to judge? My own experience defied all logic and reason. I found myself falling down a rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and government cover-ups. Every new piece of information I uncovered seemed to raise more questions than answers. Were these beings studying us? Preparing for an invasion? Or was it all part of some elaborate psychological experiment conducted by our own government? The more I dug, the less certain I became of anything. My wife watched with growing concern as I plastered the walls of our spare room with newspaper clippings, photos, and hand-drawn maps connecting sightings across the globe. She tried to get me to see a therapist, but I refused. How could I talk to someone who wouldn't believe me, who would try to rationalize away what I knew to be true? It was almost a year to the day after my encounter when something happened that shook me to my core. I was in the backyard hanging up laundry, one of the few normal tasks I still managed to do regularly. The day was overcast, a typical Scottish afternoon. Suddenly, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, just like it had that day in the forest. I looked up, and there, barely visible through a break in the clouds, was a metallic object. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I knew in my bones it was the same craft I'd seen before. My heart raced, my palms grew sweaty, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanishing behind the clouds. I stood there, frozen, the damp shirt I'd been holding fallen at my feet. Was it real? Had I imagined it? I wanted to run inside, to tell Mary, to call the police, to do something. But a part of me knew it would be useless. There would be no evidence, no proof. Just the word of a man already branded as unstable by much of the community. So I picked up the shirt, finished hanging the laundry, and went inside without saying a word. But that night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Whatever had happened to me, whatever these beings were, they weren't done with me yet. The sighting in my backyard marked a turning point for me. I realized that living in constant fear and obsession wasn't helping anyone, least of all myself. I decided to try and reclaim some semblance of normalcy in my life. It wasn't easy, but I forced myself to return to work, to face the forest that had once been my second home. The first few days were hell. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow cast by the trees sent my heart racing. But slowly, day by day, it got easier. I found comfort in the familiar routines of my job, in the smell of pine and the feel of rough bark under my hands. My colleagues, to their credit, treated me with a mix of caution and compassion. They didn't bring up the incident unless I did, but I could see the questions in their eyes. I started talking to a therapist, not about the encounter itself, but about how to cope with the aftermath. She helped me develop techniques to manage my anxiety and panic attacks. Gradually, I felt myself becoming more grounded, more present in my daily life. But even as I worked to move forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes, when I was alone in the woods, I'd catch a glimpse of something metallic out of the corner of my eye. By the time I turned to look, it was always gone. Was it real, or just my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure anymore. As the years passed, my experience became something of a local legend. People would point me out to visitors, whispering about the forester who saw the UFO. Some treated it as a joke, others with a sort of reverent fear. I learned to live with the stares and whispers, to smile and nod when someone brought it up at the pub. But inside, I was constantly wrestling with what had happened. There were days when I almost convinced myself it had all been some sort of vivid hallucination, a momentary break from reality. But then I'd catch sight of the faint scars on my hips where the spheres had grabbed me, barely visible now but still there, a permanent reminder that what I experienced was all too real. I became something of an unwilling expert on UFO sightings in the area. People would come to me with their stories, seeking validation or explanation. I listened to them all, from the clearly fabricated tales to the eerily familiar accounts that sent chills down my spine. I never claimed to have answers, but I offered what comfort I could. If nothing else, my experience had taught me the importance of listening without judgment. But with each new story, each reported sighting, I couldn't help but wonder, were they coming back? And if so, what did they want? It was on the 20th anniversary of my encounter, that something happened that brought it all rushing back. I was at home, flipping through channels on the TV, when a breaking news report caught my attention. A mass UFO sighting had occurred over Phoenix, Arizona. Thousands of people had witnessed a series of lights in a V-shaped formation, moving silently across the night sky. As I watched the shaky camera footage and listened to the eyewitness accounts, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The descriptions of the crafts, the way they moved, it was all so similar to what I had seen. For the first time in years, I felt that old obsession stirring. I stayed up all night, scouring the internet for more information, reaching out to my old contacts in the UFO community. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and frantic research. I even considered flying to Phoenix to investigate in person, something I never would have dreamed of doing just a day earlier. But as the initial excitement wore off, I forced myself to take a step back. I'd worked too hard to rebuild my life to let it all unravel now. Instead, I channeled my renewed interest into something more productive. I started writing down my experiences, not just of the encounter itself, but of everything that came after. The investigation, the media frenzy, the years of doubt and fear. It was cathartic in a way I hadn't expected, helping me process emotions I'd been bottling up for 2 decades. Now, as I sit here typing this out, I'm not sure what compelled me to finally share my story in full. Maybe it's the recent uptick in credible UFO sightings reported in the news. Maybe it's the declassified government reports hinting at things beyond our understanding. Or maybe it's simply that, after all these years, I'm finally ready to face what happened to me head on. I don't expect everyone who reads this to believe me. Hell, there are still days when I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw, what I experienced. Those minutes in the Decmont woods changed my life forever, for better or worse. I've come to accept that I may never have all the answers. I don't know why they chose me, or what they wanted. I don't know if they'll ever come back. But I do know that there's more to our universe than we can possibly imagine. My encounter opened my eyes to possibilities I never would have considered before. It's a heavy burden to bear, but also in some ways a gift. To those who've had similar experiences, know that you're not alone. And to those who haven't, I ask only that you keep an open mind. The truth, as they say, is out there. And sometimes, it comes looking for you when you least expect it.
If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey.
Third story, the Manas's incident, when reality took a detour. It was supposed to be a routine flight from Mallorca to Valencia. As a commercial airline pilot with over 15 years of experience, I'd done this route countless times. The weather was clear, visibility was good, and everything seemed normal as we took off just after 11 p.m. on November 11th, 1979. I remember checking my watch and thinking how I'd be home in bed in just a couple of hours. If only I'd known what was about to unfold, I might have called in sick that night. The first sign that something was off came about 40 minutes into the flight. My co-pilot and I were chatting idly about weekend plans when I noticed a strange glimmer in the distance. At first, I thought it might be the lights of another aircraft, but something about it didn't look quite right. The lights were too bright, too intense, and they seemed to be moving in a way that defied the laws of physics. I blinked hard, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me after a long day. But when I looked again, the lights were still there, and they seemed to be getting closer. I nudged my co-pilot and pointed out the window. "Hey, you see that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned over, squinting into the darkness. His face paled as he spotted what I was looking at. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. The lights were moving faster now, darting across the sky in impossible zigzag patterns. They would accelerate to incredible speeds, then stop on a dime, hovering motionless for a few seconds before zipping off in another direction. It was like nothing I'd ever seen in all my years of flying. My heart started racing as I realized we might be in serious danger. Whatever those things were, they were getting closer to our aircraft, and they were moving with a purpose that seemed almost intelligent. I radioed air traffic control, trying to keep the panic out of my voice as I reported the unidentified lights. The controller sounded skeptical at first, but as I described what we were seeing, I could hear the concern creeping into his voice. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic radio communications and split-second decisions. The lights were now directly in front of us, three distinct orbs of blindingly bright, pulsating energy. They seemed to be toying with us, darting towards our plane, and then veering away at the last second. My co-pilot was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he gripped the controls. I knew I had to do something fast. In that moment, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I announced to air traffic control that I was diverting our flight to the nearest airport. It was a risky move. We had a plane full of passengers who were expecting to land in Valencia, and diverting a commercial flight is not something done lightly. But as I watched those impossible lights dancing around us, I knew we had no choice. The safety of everyone on board was my responsibility, and right now, staying on our current course felt like flying straight into the unknown. As I began to alter our course, my mind raced with questions. What were these lights? Were they some kind of advanced military aircraft? Or were they something not from this world? I'd always been a rational person, skeptical of UFO stories and alien encounters. But what I was seeing with my own eyes defied any rational explanation. The lights seemed to react to our change in direction, shifting their formation to stay ahead of us. It was as if they knew our intentions, anticipating our every move. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at the cabin crew call button, wondering if I should alert the passengers. But what would I even say? Ladies and gentlemen, we're being pursued by unidentified flying objects. It sounded insane, even in my own head. So I kept quiet, focusing all my energy on getting us safely to the ground. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Every second felt like an hour as we descended towards Manas's airport in Valencia. The lights continued their eerie dance around our aircraft, sometimes disappearing for a few moments only to reappear in a completely different position. My co-pilot was frantically scanning our instruments, trying to make sense of what was happening. "They're not showing up on radar," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How is that possible?" I didn't have an answer for him. Nothing about this situation made sense. As we got closer to the airport, I hoped that maybe the lights would disappear, that whatever was out there would decide we weren't worth the trouble once we were near civilization. But they persisted, staying with us all the way down to 4,000 feet. The airport was now visible in the distance, its runway lights a welcome sight amidst the chaos. Just as I was about to breathe a sigh of relief, thinking we were almost out of this nightmare, something happened that I still struggle to explain to this day. The three lights suddenly merged into one massive, glowing orb. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, growing larger and brighter until it was almost painful to look at. Then, in a fraction of a second, it shot straight up into the sky at a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The sudden acceleration was so intense that it created a visible distortion in the air, like a ripple in the fabric of reality itself. And then, just like that, it was gone. The sky was dark and empty, as if nothing had ever been there. The silence in the cockpit was deafening. My co-pilot and I exchanged a look of disbelief, both of us struggling to process what we had just witnessed. As we made our final approach to Manas's airport, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the plane. Somehow, through sheer force of will and years of training, I managed to land the aircraft safely. As soon as we touched down, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that relief was short-lived. The moment we came to a stop, I was bombarded with questions from air traffic control, airport security, and eventually, military officials. They wanted to know every detail of what we had seen, but how could I possibly explain something I didn't understand myself? I described the lights, their impossible movements, the way they seemed to anticipate our actions. I told them about the final moments when the lights merged and shot into the sky. With each retelling, I could see the disbelief in their eyes, even as they nodded and took notes. It was clear they were taking this seriously, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they thought I was either crazy or hiding something. The passengers were confused and upset about the unexpected landing, demanding explanations that I couldn't give. The airline executives were furious about the decision to divert the flight. I felt like I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions, all while trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. As the night wore on, things took an even stranger turn. Word got out about our encounter, and soon the airport was swarming with reporters, UFO enthusiasts, and curious onlookers. I was shuttled from one debriefing to another, repeating my story to stone-faced military officers and wide-eyed researchers. They showed me radar data that confirmed there had indeed been unidentified objects in the sky that night, moving at speeds that no known aircraft could achieve. But the data was incomplete, full of gaps and inconsistencies. It was as if whatever we had encountered was able to appear and disappear at will, playing hide and seek with our technology. At one point, I overheard a heated argument between two officials. One was insisting that this was a matter of national security and needed to be classified immediately. The other argued that the public had a right to know. I felt caught in the middle of something much bigger than myself, a pawn in a game I didn't understand. As the sun began to rise, casting an eerie glow over the airport, I finally had a moment to myself. I stepped outside for some fresh air, my head spinning from the night's events. That's when I saw them, two sleek fighter jets taking off from the runway, climbing rapidly into the early morning sky. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they were heading in the same direction, where we had last seen the lights. Were they going to investigate? To engage? The thought filled me with a mixture of fear and fascination. I wanted answers, but at the same time, part of me hoped those jets wouldn't find anything. Because if they did, if there really was something out there beyond our understanding, what did that mean for us? For our place in the universe? As I watched the jets disappear into the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Little did I know how right I was, and how much my life was about to change. In the days that followed, my life became a whirlwind of interrogations, medical examinations, and paranoia. The airline put me on indefinite leave, citing the need for a thorough investigation into the incident. But I could tell from the way they looked at me, the hushed conversations that stopped when I entered a room, that they were afraid. Afraid of what I'd seen, afraid of what it might mean for their reputation if word got out. I was subjected to countless psychological evaluations, each one more intrusive than the last. They wanted to know about my childhood, my relationships, my beliefs. Had I ever experimented with drugs? Did I have any history of mental illness in my family? It felt less like they were trying to understand what had happened, and more like they were looking for a way to discredit me, to explain away what I'd seen as some sort of hallucination or delusion. But I knew what I saw, and I wasn't the only one. My co-pilot and I were kept apart for most of the investigation, but when we finally had a chance to talk, I was relieved to find that his recollection matched mine almost exactly. We spent hours going over every detail, trying to make sense of it all. He confided in me that he'd been having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of those impossible lights. I understood all too well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them dancing across the sky, felt that sense of otherworldly presence. But it wasn't just the memory of that night that haunted me. Strange things began happening in my daily life. I'd catch glimpses of oddly bright lights out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. My electronic devices would malfunction for no apparent reason, turning on and off at random or displaying garbled text. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to find all the clocks in my house had stopped at exactly 11:11, the time we had first spotted the lights during our flight. Was I losing my mind, or was something still out there, watching me? As the weeks turned into months, the official investigation seemed to go nowhere. There were conflicting reports about what the fighter jets had found, or hadn't found, that morning. Some sources claimed they had encountered similar phenomena, while others insisted they had seen nothing out of the ordinary. The government released a statement attributing the incident to unusual atmospheric conditions and pilot fatigue, but it rang hollow to me. I knew what I had seen, and it was no weather balloon or optical illusion. The media frenzy eventually died down, but I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with finding answers, spending countless hours researching similar incidents, reaching out to other pilots who claimed to have had encounters. I joined online forums and support groups for people who had experienced the unexplainable. Some of their stories chilled me to the bone, eerily similar to my own experience. Others seemed far-fetched, even to me. But there was a common thread running through all of them, a sense of having brushed up against something beyond our understanding, and the frustration of being dismissed or disbelieved. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. I was digging through declassified government documents when I came across a report from 1952 detailing a series of UFO sightings over Washington, D.C. The similarities to my own experience were uncanny, multiple objects moving at impossible speeds, appearing and disappearing from radar. But it was a small detail buried in the report that really caught my attention. One of the pilots described seeing 3 lights that merged into a single, brilliant orb before vanishing. It was exactly what I had witnessed over Manasses. My hands were shaking as I read and reread the passage. This wasn't just some isolated incident. Whatever I had encountered had been visiting our skies for decades, maybe even centuries. The realization both terrified and exhilarated me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. But if these beings had been among us for so long, what did they want? Why reveal themselves to some, but remain hidden from most? As my obsession grew, my personal life began to unravel. My wife, initially supportive, grew increasingly frustrated with my single-minded focus on the incident. She couldn't understand why I couldn't just let it go and move on with our lives. Friends started to avoid me, uncomfortable with my constant talk of UFOs and government cover-ups. I lost touch with reality, spending days at a time locked in my study, poring over grainy photos and eyewitness accounts. I started seeing patterns everywhere, in cloud formations, in the way cars were parked on the street, in the random sequence of numbers on a license plate. Everything seemed to be a sign, a hidden message that I was desperately trying to decode. I knew I was spiraling, but I couldn't stop. The need to understand, to make sense of what had happened that night, consumed me entirely. It was like a fire burning inside me, driving me to the brink of madness. The breaking point came almost a year after the incident. I had been up for days, fueled by coffee and an almost manic energy, when I thought I'd finally cracked the code. I'd convinced myself that the lights we'd seen were trying to communicate, that their movements were a form of language that I could decipher if I just studied them long enough. In my sleep-deprived state, I decided I needed to get back in the air, to try and make contact again. I snuck onto the airfield where I used to work, managed to get into a small private plane, and was about to take off when security finally caught up with me. As they dragged me away, I was babbling about needing to complete the conversation, totally unaware of how far I'd fallen. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a psychiatric ward, my wife crying by my bedside. It was a harsh wake-up call, a moment of clarity that made me realize I'd lost myself in my quest for answers. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I've worked hard to rebuild my life, to find a balance between seeking understanding and maintaining my sanity. I've been through therapy, reconnected with my family, and even started flying again, though only small private charters. The experience over Manasses changed me forever, opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered before. But I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some questions might never be answered. I still look up at the night sky with a mixture of wonder and apprehension, knowing that there's so much we don't understand about our universe. Sometimes on clear nights, I'll sit outside and watch the stars, half expecting to see those mysterious lights again. They haven't reappeared, at least not to me. But I know they're out there somewhere. And I know that someday, whether it's in my lifetime or not, we'll learn the truth about what's visiting our skies. Until then, I'll keep watching, keep wondering, and keep sharing my story. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the truth is out there. We just have to be brave enough to face it.
So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.